All right, great. So, hello. Happy September. Wherever you are watching from, all 50 states are back in session, back to the grind. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're coming from. Hello. My name is Imari Ventura Roches. I am a speech language pathologist. I'm an educational administrator, and I'm a special needs parent coach. It's that time of the month again where I get on and chat with moms. We talk about different issues across different age ranges. You guys put your questions in the chat. Post your questions. I'll get to them. Tonight, we are scheduled to talk about sensory versus emotional regulation, understanding the difference. Okay, why did I pick this topic, right? Sensory versus emotional regulation. Okay, why? Why is this important? At the beginning of the school year, it's important to evaluate these things first in your own household with your own child. Emotional and sensory and or, because a child doesn't have to have both. Emotional or sensory dysregulation, being out, not regulated, both present as obstacles to learning. Both sensory and emotional dysregulation present as obstacles to learning. What does that mean? If a child is sensory dysregulated, they could be triggered by so many things in the environment that they really have to process and integrate all of the outside stimuli before they can focus, attend, get calm, and move on with learning. And by the time they get to that point, this session may be over. They may have missed a significant amount of the lesson. Emotional regulation. Why is that important? Because a child who's emotionally dysregulated, full of thoughts and feelings that are adverse to learning, is really going to have a hard time, perhaps focusing, steadying themselves, regulating themselves, calming down, and getting ready to learn. So both emotional and sensory dysregulation present as obstacles to learning. And us as moms, because if you don't know and you're new here, I'm a mom too. When we have an understanding and a grasp on these things, we can ask the right questions, we can ask for the right help, and we can make sure to create an environment that is helps our kids to regulate even better. Okay, so welcome and thanks for being here. Um, is this a sensory or an emotional meltdown? I want you to think about that. Carry that question into the next week, right? As we wrap up this week and we begin the last week of September. When your child, whatever they do, ask yourself, is this a sensory or an emotional meltdown? Understanding the difference empowers you to respond the right way, right? Because if it's a sensory meltdown because of something in the environment, maybe, and you're giving a hug and you're giving comfort, that's very nice, but it's not necessarily the solution. So the appropriate response comes from you, but you got to know which one it is. So let's talk about 5 very distinguishable differences between a sensory regulation and emotional regulation. Okay. There is some overlap at some point, for some things, but I want to talk about what makes them mutually exclusive. Number one, if you see me glance over, it's because I'm checking out my notes. Number one, the trigger. Sensory regulation means that the child is triggered by external sensory input. For example, noise, lights, textures, smell, or movement. For example, a child covers their ears at a loud birthday party. I'm sure you've seen that, right? You guys know I own like a couple of like 3 pairs of earmuffs, of noise canceling headphones, because I took my children to Monster Truck. And I mean, this is like beyond what an everyday sound is. And so it's very triggering. And I saw a lot of kids with them, right? So the trigger, right, in a sensory meltdown can be external. Not always, but oftentimes it is. Sometimes it is internal, right? It's something that is stem from the central nervous system. An emotional regulation that is triggered by internal feelings, thoughts, right? For example, frustration, sadness, disappointment, anger, right? A child breaks a toy, a child cries when a toy is broken. Let's give that example. Their favorite toy broke, and then they start to cry and have an emotional meltdown, and they become emotionally dysregulated. So the trigger is very, very important to know, to understand what's coming next and how you should respond. Number two, distinguishable difference between a sensory and emotional regulation. The child's awareness about it. Now, this is going to depend some on age. However, it applies to some. In sensory regulation, children are often not fully aware of what's bothering them. It just can kind of feel overwhelming and frustrating, right? They're not fully aware. That doesn't mean you, as the adult, is not aware. They might not know that all the big, loud sounds at an arena are overwhelming for them, but it feels overwhelming, right? It feels like kind of confusing and too much. For emotional regulation, children are usually more aware of the cause. Once again, this depends on age, but if they have language and they have an understanding, they're aware and able to express themselves to say things, for example, like, I am mad, I am angry, I'm upset because I didn't get what I want, right? Okay, so the child's awareness will tell you whether it's a sensory or emotional regulation or dysregulation, rather. Okay, number three reason, um, distinguishable difference between a sensory and emotional regulation is the body's response. The body's response. When we talk about sensory regulation, oftentimes there's a motor response to it. So the nervous system reacts strongly, for example, but not to exclude, covering ears, running away, hiding, rocking, screaming, right? Stimming. It looks more like fight, flight, or freeze, right? I'm sure that you've heard that before. Fight, flight, or freeze. And that's just a central nervous response to activity, to an action, something that's occurred. In an emotional dysregulating situation, the response is tied to the child's feelings. For example, crying, yelling, refusing, arguing, sulking. It doesn't all have to be negative. Extreme happiness, excitedness, overjoy. It's less about escaping a sensation and more about expressing a feeling. Now, all kiddos, right, especially some of the kiddos of the moms here, do not have all the vocabulary to express. And they may also just not be verbal. They may be nonverbal. But there is a difference in the response, right? We can really tell the difference between a fright, flight, or freeze response versus something that's highly emotional, yelling, screaming, crying. Number four, reason that distinguishes emotional and sensory regulation is the recovery time. The recovery time, that's going to be a big indicator in your house, right? Because you want a smoother day. So you're going to be very aware of the recovery time. So recovery often takes longer because the body, in a sensory regulation, the body often takes longer to recover after an after a sensory overload. In a sensory regulation situation, recovery often takes longer because the body needs time to calm down after the nervous system overload. Sometimes calming tools are required, right? Like the weighted blanket, like fidgets, like quiet space, like a break. These type of additional supports are needed. Now, the recovery time for emotional regulation, recovery may be shorter, especially if the emotion is acknowledged, right? So if a child emotionally gets up to the peak, we call it 0 to 60. Sometimes if they get to the highest one and then you give in to what they want, or you acknowledge their feelings and give them immediate support, sometimes that could de-escalate quickly. Acknowledge and validate their emotional response can make it de-escalate quickly. A hug, comfort, or problem solving can resolve it faster. Okay. The recovery time is going to be very telling to you as to whether it is emotional or a sensory meltdown. Number 5, the fifth reason that distinguishes a sensory from an emotional uh, dysregulation is the support strategy. And that's how you, mom, or any caregiver are going to respond. So for sensory regulation, the support comes from sensory accommodations, right? Many of you saw earlier this year, I was creating sensory calm kits, right? I started to sell sensory soothing material, sensory toys, right? For households, for families, for moms and dads to use with their kids who have ADHD, who are on the spectrum, who have different developmental needs. The support strategy makes a big difference. For example, I mentioned noise canceling headphones, sensory breaks, calming tools or fidgets, and structured sensory diets. I have a reel. You have to go into my archive and check out how do you know if your child needs a sensory diet. But I was working with a school earlier this year who was contemplating adding a one-to-one para. They wanted an additional support. I suggested to them the girl needs a sensory diet. She needs structure and routine in the classroom and at home. They did it. They wrote out the sensory diet for me. They had everything that she would do throughout the day, her whole schedule, and then how they would use sensory tools and breaks throughout the day to keep her calm, right? She was the type of child who was hyper, and so she needed heavy work, and she needed the lap pad helped her a lot during breakfast and the transition after. Weighted utensils helped her a lot at mealtime to settle down and to ease into the next activity. So different strategies if you can have in your toolbox will help you understand how to give support in whether it's a sensory or emotional dysregulation. For an emotional regulation, the support strategy comes from emotional coaching, right? Naming feelings, modeling calming responses. For emotional regulation, the support strategy is going to be emotional coaching. For example, naming feelings, modeling calm responses, teaching coping techniques, deep breathing, words to express needs. Okay. There might be some professionals watching or in the group who've used zones of regulation. I know that as a therapist, I use it too. I have one in my house for my kids, and it's a chart with different colors, green, red, green, yellow, orange, red, right? And it escalates that way and provides the words to use. And the child has to identify where they are on the chart. Okay. Another suggestion that I give with this emotional regulation and whatever the coping strategy is going to be, for example, if it's deep breathing and it's the strategy, breathe in a flower, blow out a candle, if that's going to be it, the child needs to practice it outside of the tantrum, outside of the meltdown, right? It's almost not fair when you ask a child to use their strategy when they're in the crux of the situation, when they're really in the crisis moment. You ask them to utilize a strategy they've never used. So it's important to practice some of these things outside of a crisis so that they are easily accessible at the moment when they're really needed. How do you feel about that? Okay. So, as we wrap up, I want you to know that both sensory and emotionally regulated are equally important for children with special needs. Not every child struggles with both. Not every child struggles with both. Some kids are purely sensory. Some kids are purely emotional. Some kids have overlap in both. However, if you can understand the difference, you can anticipate what's going to happen next with them and recognize how to respond in a way that's going to be effective. If a child is upset and sad because they got in an argument or they had a difficult social situation, are you going to give them a weighted blanket? No, right? Because it's not the correct strategy. Moms don't have to have all the right answers, okay? It's certainly not right away. What matters is noticing patterns and trying supporting strategies. That's what's important here. And today I'm offering some understanding just to get a grasp on both. Remember, when you understand the difference, you can respond with the right kind of support. And that builds trust and helps your child to thrive. Think about removing obstacles. When you get a handle on identifying and supporting sensory and emotional dysregulation, when you get a handle of that and you really understand it in your child, when you observe them and you can recognize the patterns, you are removing obstacles towards learning. All right, you guys, my name again is Imari Ventura Roches. This has been a lot of fun. This has been great. I'm gonna have another chat like this on Tuesday. Over the summer, I started doing these twice a month, whereas usually I just would do them once a month. And so I'll do one really that's just based on more on strategies called Calm and Connected. That'll be next week. I didn't do anything last week. I released the digital download called Connected, Calm and Connected. It's just something about alliteration today. It's like not working. I released Calm and Connected earlier this month. So download your copy. It's on Teachers Pay Teachers, and you can check out my storefront. Um, Last Friday, I didn't do any, last Thursday rather, I didn't do anything. It was 9/11. It was September 11th. I'm from New York, so I'm very sensitive to that date because it means a lot to me and because I was in high school when 9/11 happened and it's a significant day for me. It's a day of observance for me. So I didn't have a live, I didn't chat, I didn't release anything. But we're on for this week. I think 2 times a month may become the norm. I think you guys are enjoying the content quite a bit. So please invite your friends, invite other moms, your neighbor, your sister, your cousin, and check us out. Please at www.everycr, CR is for communication resources.com. I'm getting booked up. I'm booked until October 10th, but I am available for evaluations for now and after that. So let me know what you need. I hope everybody has a very good weekend and take care. Bye bye.